Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. Idaho is a big state and it covers a lot of territory. Idaho Matters wants to take you to every corner of the Gem State by visiting all 44 counties. And we need your help to do that. Email us your story ideas at idahomatters@boisestate.edu for our new series we're calling Idaho 44. And be sure to join us each weekday at noon and 8 on Idaho Matters and travel the state with us. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. If you are a regular listener, you know this is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines around our region this week. We have a full panel today, including Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer, and Kelsey Mosley Morris, National Reproductive Rights reporter with the state's newsroom, is joining us first to talk about some big news in regards to Planned Parenthood. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Kelsey, as I mentioned, some pretty big news for Planned Parenthood. A federal judge issued a new order that protects funding. Before we get into all of that, can you remind us of the funding issue, or we should say defunding issue, that Planned Parenthood across the country was facing?
This is part of a provision that was passed in the big reconciliation budget bill that was passed earlier in July, sometimes referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That was tucked into like some of the broader Medicaid cuts that clinics that provided abortions or clinics that were tied to other clinics that provide abortions and who billed more than $800,000 to Medicaid in fiscal year 2023 would not be allowed to receive federal Medicaid funding under the new provisions. So that affects a lot of clinics, and it pretty much decimates a lot of the services that are available.
Okay, so can we go into that a little bit more, Kelsey? Because as you mentioned, I mean, we're talking a lot of clinics through Planned Parenthood, but I think it's important to note that there are Planned Parenthood clinics that do not provide abortions, and so they would have kept their funding. Correct?
It's complicated because
Okay.
I mean, the ones that don't provide it are still reliant on federal Medicaid funding to
Mm-hmm.
provide their services for reproductive health reasons, STI testing and pap smears and general wellness things that people are
Mm-hmm.
dependent on. So it's kind of like a domino effect, where these clinics that are smaller and don't provide abortions, but they're in rural areas and they are part of a network. And so a lot of times those are the clinics that will go first because the ones that are providing abortions are more in the urban areas and they bill more and they have more to fall back on. So, you know, it, even if you're trying to target clinics, you're still affecting the entire system.
So explain to us the Medicaid part of this, Kelsey, because as you mentioned, this is what more than $800,000. That was just in fiscal year 2023, though.
Right. Yeah, they changed that number a couple different times and I'm not sure why, but that's part of the lawsuit is that they're specifically targeting Planned Parenthood, knowing that there's this threshold that mostly only Planned Parenthoods meet. There's a couple different independent networks, like one in Maine, that has also sued that does bill more than that per year, but it's pretty rare. So that's why they're saying like there's this unfair targeting going on of Planned Parenthood clinics, which has long been a goal of anti-abortion activists and many Republican elected officials.
Hmm. Okay, so then talk to us about this lawsuit that was filed, and it was filed by the national group. Is that correct? Planned Parenthood Federation of America.
It was filed by them as well as two affiliates, one in Massachusetts and one in Utah. And I assume that's kind of the set up because Massachusetts does provide abortions at their clinics and Utah would not. So I
Mm.
think they're trying to represent both interests there. Um,
Hmm.
and they filed this like the day after the bill was signed. So they acted very quickly, and there's been some back and forth now with this whole lawsuit since that we can talk about.
Okay, so let's talk about this because the attorneys for the Trump administration, they appealed what the initial injunction. So can you tell us what this initial injunction was?
Yeah, so first they had a temporary restraining order for about 2 weeks right after the lawsuit was filed. Like the same day, the judge granted a
Hmm.
temporary restraining order that said you can't cut the funding right now until we do more with this case. And so they had 2 weeks of bought time, but in that time, there were still clinic closures of Planned Parenthoods who said, we can't take this risk. We can't even, take the gamble that they're not going to cut our funding or they're not going to retroactively ask for it. So in those 2 weeks, two clinics in Ohio have closed. And yeah, I think in those 2 weeks, that was the only one. But then there was supposed to be, when the temporary restraining order expired, there was supposed to be an injunction decision on the 14th. And the initial injunction order only protected the clinics that were already not targeted in the bill. So it was like clinics that didn't provide abortions as of October 1 and clinics that didn't bill more than 800,000 for Medicaid, which is basically what the bill said. So Planned Parenthood, I think, was not expecting that, and
Hmm.
um, they followed up with another clarification, and we can go into that. But the Trump administration did appeal that initial injunction, even though it was basically what the bill already said, and that already went to one of the appeals courts, whichever district it's in. So that's still pending as of this moment.
Okay. So let's get to this week with this federal judge making a ruling and what happened in that.
Yeah, she there was a clarification requested by Planned Parenthood and its two affiliates
Hmm.
where they were asking, this preliminary injunction, she outlined, the judge in Massachusetts outlined very specific reasons why she thought Planned Parenthood was going to was going to prevail in this case, and why she thought there were some equal protection issues that were at play, and some freedom of speech issues. And she's like, I think you're likely to succeed. And usually that would mean there was a more sweeping injunction provided to all the clinics, but she targeted
Hmm.
it very specifically. And they were like, we don't understand. We would like you to like protect all of the clinics instead of just these specific ones, because it will cause very big harm to people just seeking healthcare if this is allowed to stand. And so I think it was 1 week exactly after that initial injunction, she put out another one that said all the clinics should be protected. So it was a more sweeping injunction. I don't know what that's going to mean moving forward, though, because, like I said, in the time just in that week since she
Hmm.
made that preliminary injunction of the first one, more clinics closed. There were, I think, 5 in California, and there were like 3 in Texas. And there's, it's just these little pieces everywhere that are starting to collapse, even with that promise of injunction. And I think it's kind of a side effect of our current legal environment, I think, of not being sure that people are going to follow court orders, and not being sure that preliminary injunctions that apply nationwide will be held up in court, and
Hmm.
not being sure that the Medicaid funding will get cut anyway, so, and that they won't ask for it after if they are successful, and that would be on the hook for millions of dollars potentially. So, these effects are going to take place regardless of what happens with the injunctions, unfortunately.
So, Kelsey, before I let you go, do we know anything about how this would impact Planned Parenthood of Idaho here? I mean, in Idaho, but in Eastern Oregon as well.
So far, they have not limited their services. There are some clinics who, like in Ohio, they have stopped taking Medicaid patients at all, or they've limited some of their contraception options. So far, when I asked, they have not been doing that yet. But the longer this goes on and the more uncertainty there is, I don't know what that will mean for our clinics here. There have already been some closures in the last year or so, I think in Twin
Hmm.
Falls, and some of the smaller areas like we were talking about. So
Hmm.
the more that they get stretched, the more the possibility increases that we'll see some of our more urban centers start to close as they try to consolidate and keep those services together in other places.
All right. Well, Kelsey, really appreciate your reporting on this. We've been talking with Kelsey Mosley Morris. She's the National Reproductive Rights Reporter for the State's Newsroom. If you want to read her full article, go to their website. Clark, the director of the Idaho National Laboratory, was in Boise earlier this week. He was meeting with legislators. Can you talk to us about what he said, in particular, in regards to the Trump administration as what he calls ushering in a nuclear renaissance here in Idaho?
Yeah, sure thing, Gemma. Happy to. Thanks for having me on today. But yeah, you're exactly right. Idaho National Laboratory Director John Wagner was in Boise on Wednesday at the Idaho State Capitol for a committee meeting with legislators talking about federal issues. And you're exactly right. He told them that the Trump administration is ushering in what he described as a nuclear renaissance that he said is kind of fundamentally changing the picture when it comes to nuclear energy. And he said Idaho's going to take the lead in this area because of Idaho National Lab, Gemma, which is one of 17 U.S. Department of Energy labs. It's located in eastern Idaho. They have this vast 890 square mile research facility out in the desert. But Director Wagner said that he's been a nuclear engineer for 30 years, and the shift and why this is, a new direction and he's calling it a nuclear renaissance is he says he went from a time period where over the last several years and decades, the government had been shutting down nuclear reactors and decommissioning them, to now there's all this talk about, for the first time in 50 years, Idaho National Lab is going to be building and permitting new nuclear reactors with the plan to have multiple nuclear reactors come online before the end of this decade. But by 2030 is the timeline that they're looking at. In particular, Director Wagner briefed legislators on 4 executive orders that President Trump issued in May that talk about everything from reforming the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was created to basically ensure the safe handling of radioactive materials, to using nuclear technology for national security and defense, to reforming nuclear reactor testing. And so all these different executive orders that the president had issued in May. And it's kind of a different story, Jim. And we've heard and talked a lot about a lot of cuts to different government agencies and programs with the new administration, but it's a very different message and tone that we're hearing out of the folks in Eastern Idaho at Idaho National Lab.
And Clark, I think you mentioned this, but talk to us too about the fact that the INL is what, building their first new nuclear reactor in 50 years. So,
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right, Jim. INL is considered the nation's leading nuclear laboratory, and I believe this is the first time they're building and permitting new nuclear reactors since like 1973. It's been 50 years, and overall in our country, other than I think they highlighted 2 plants in the last 2 or 3 years that were built in Georgia. But other than that, nuclear reactors have not been coming online in this country. And so it's a whole new shift. But you're exactly right. It's been 50 years since INL has built and permitted new nuclear reactors. And there's plans for multiple new nuclear reactors to come online by 2030. They talked about this aggressive timeline that the Trump administration is pushing. And so, yeah, it's a real change in direction for INL. They talked about, for years we buried our spent nuclear fuel out in the desert, and they talked about how now the change has shifted to where they're thinking there's still value in that material, and that people could be mining it in the future. So kind of a different direction, and it does seem like that Idaho is going to be kind of at the center of this when you hear about a lot of the activity and efforts around nuclear activity that will really be ramping up, Gemma, over the next several years.
And Brian, speaking of nuclear energy, you recently wrote an opinion piece in the Idaho Statesman about this issue. And you did begin by saying that you are a fan of nuclear energy. So I want to start there, but you are also saying the idea to bring this a facility to Jerome just is not the answer. Can you talk to us about this?
Sure, yeah. So I've been a fan of nuclear energy for a long time, both because of its safety profile compared to other types of energy, and because it generates much less carbon, none basically.
Hmm.
Um, but there have been headlines around a series of public hearings that have been held down in Jerome with the idea of building a set of small modular reactors out there. Um, and the more I have looked into this, the more it appears to me to be a completely unserious proposal that's been brought forth by people who don't really have either the expertise or the means to build what they say they plan to build.
And so, with all of that, Brian, do you think this is really going to happen in Jerome? Because when I first read about this, I was like, wait a minute, what? A nuclear facility in Jerome?
Yeah, no, I was initially I liked the idea when I hadn't looked at it too much. But there are a number of issues. For one thing, this company initially said it planned to build small modular reactors that are manufactured by a company called NuScale. This would offer them certain advantages because that design's already been approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But NuScale says they want nothing to do with these people, more or less. That even the environmental, though the environmental impact statement that this company, Sawtooth Energy and Development Corporation, had put out indicated that they planned to build NuScale small modular reactors. NuScale has no plans to provide them with reactors. They also have no publicly known financing for a project of this size. It's very similar to another proposal that was floated in Eastern Idaho a few years ago called the Carbon Free Power Project, and the final price tag for that was something like $9.3 billion. Uh, these folks have no known financial backing. They say they can get some tax credits and things like that, but that gets you nowhere in the neighborhood of building a nuclear reactor. And a potential wrinkle for raising that amount of funding is that the project manager is a federal felon with a history of financial
Mm.
crime.
Okay, well, that puts a whole new twist on it. Folks, if you want to read Brian's opinion piece, just go to the Idaho Statesman. So, Caitlin, what in the world happened at a city council meeting in Butte City over in eastern Idaho? Did I read correctly that the mayor pulled a gun on people?
Yeah, so this one is really one we've been following pretty closely over here. So Butte City is they have a population of about 78 people. They are about 3 miles from Arco, out there by Idaho National Laboratory, sort of. So the Butte City mayor, his name is Kevin Turner, and he was charged a few weeks ago with misdemeanor exhibition or use of a deadly weapon. According to the police documents, during the meeting, there were issues raised, basically regarding conflicts of interest with his wife, Jessica, or not Jessica, sorry, his wife, Erica Lange Turner, being the
Hmm.
clerk, treasurer, and secretary for the city, while her husband is the mayor. And essentially, Mayor Turner became upset about this and pulled a gun out of his pocket that was in the holster, as what we've heard, and he slammed it on the table. Um, According to the police documents, this happened while he was trying to fire City Councilman Stephen Avery. But we recently did a follow-up on this story, and the witnesses and people that were there, including City Councilman Avery, told us that that wasn't what happened from their perspective. So what they told me was that during the city council meeting, they brought up issues over a city Facebook page ran by the mayor's wife, Erica Turner. It was called Butte City Happenings, and then it was called Butte City Information, and it's now been deleted. Not able to go in and see that anymore. But essentially, locals were upset because they would comment on it and then they would be banned and they'd not be able to see the events and stuff in their town. They said that the page was rampant with bullying. So a lot of the citizens showed up to the city council meeting to talk about this. And that is kind of what started the incident, is what the witnesses say. Councilman Avery said there was no talk about firing him. And actually, the mayor technically can't fire a city councilman because he's an elected official, so he'd have to be recalled by voters in an election. So the people that were there were pretty upset, saying that the police report wasn't exactly accurate. So we did bring in Stephen Avery and his wife, Bonnie Jobson, to our newsroom, and we interviewed them for our follow up. And City Councilman Avery's wife, Bonnie, did provide us with a video that she took during the incident where the camera's pointed at the floor, but you can hear the incident go on in the background and what sounds to be like the gun hitting the table. And we talked to a couple other people that were there as well, who said that he waved it around in front of them. And a couple people you can hear run out of the building, yelling and saying that they felt that they were in danger, and the police were then called. But right now, we did reach out to Mayor Turner, who said that he doesn't want to comment, that because he is hiring an attorney, but he is expected to be in court here soon, and so we'll keep doing follow-ups.
Caitlin, I don't know if I heard you say this or not, so my apologies. Did the mayor resign?
He did not. So
Oh,
he
okay.
actually wasn't. He wasn't an elected mayor. He was appointed
Oh,
to the position after the former mayor moved, and so he just kind of stepped into the role. And up and coming in the next election, it's not clear whether or not he's going to run or if he's going to step down. But as of today, he has not resigned. So we're following it pretty closely. We tried to reach out to the city as well. This is probably important to mention, but because the only city employees in Butte City are Mayor Turner and his wife, we haven't been able to
oh,
contact them. So
okay.
as far as we know, he hasn't resigned.
Okay, thank you for that update. Logan, some new guidelines have come out in regards to capital defense guidelines here in Idaho. Can you tell us why these new guidelines were needed?
Absolutely, Gemma. So this is some reporting that comes from my colleague at Idaho Reports, Ruth Brown. When we're talking about capital defense cases, we're talking about the death penalty. So if you're being charged with a crime and the government says the penalty for that crime should be death, in order to make sure that everybody gets their rights to a fair trial, the government has to make sure that you have attorneys who can, you know, stand up and carry out a death penalty case if the death penalty is on the table. Folks will know Brian Koberger just recently received his sentence, but the death penalty was on the table for him until that plea deal was reached. So he had to have attorneys who were certified to work with the work on cases that involve the death penalty. Now, Idaho's public defense system has undergone quite an overhaul in the last several years. There have been decades-long problems with the way that the system was formerly set up. It used to be a world where each county was individually responsible for hiring its own public defenders and making sure all of that was set up. And then there was kind of a statewide funding pool that they paid into to hire capital defense attorneys if they needed to, because these are really expensive if you have to have a really good lawyer who has all this extra training. And for these cases, you also have to have two attorneys, one who serves as the lead and one who serves as the second chair. So this was a system that was not working as well as it could have, and the state was facing lawsuits about the public defense system being understaffed and not structured the right way. So in the last several years, the state has moved to a state public defender's office. So now that it's at the state level, they're setting up this new office, and now it's going to be the state's attorneys who are working on these capital defense cases. So in the past, it was the Public Defense Commission that had guidelines and rules about what the qualifications were. And now the state legislature has dissolved that Public Defense Commission. It's not needed anymore because we've transitioned into this new office. So there was a brief window of time when between the commission closing and the new office opening and implementing these new rules where we were kind of in a limbo and didn't have any official rules for what the qualifications for a capital qualified defense attorney would be. But now that the State Public Defender's Office has put their guidelines out, which is the crux of Ruth's story, we know what those requirements are going to be.
And they are similar to what the requirements used to be. And I think we should note, Logan, too, that there are only a handful of attorneys in the entire state who meet these new requirements. And we should note that before all of this changeover, there were more public defenders who had these qualifications. A lot of them left to go into private practice. But with that said, I mean, Logan, people might be surprised by how many attorneys actually meet these qualifications when we are talking about death sentence cases.
That's right. Yeah. So according to Ruth's reporting, there are currently only 13 attorneys in the state of Idaho who are qualified to be the lead counsel. That's that first chair. Five of those 13 attorneys work for the new state public defender's office. Eight of them are private attorneys. And then there's another 18 attorneys in the state who are qualified to be the second chair. So be the secondary attorney, but not the lead attorney. The public defender's office is working on improving those numbers. They're going to be paying for some training for attorneys. But pretty high requirements to meet. I mean, obviously, if the state of Idaho says you murdered someone and they want to put you on death row, you don't want somebody who's their first day out of law school defending you in the courtroom.
Right.
The lead counsel has to have 10 or more years of criminal defense litigation. They have to have had 10 or more felony jury trials tried to a verdict, and they have to have been the first or second counsel in a capital case before. Among other requirements. The co-counsel, so that secondary chair, has to have 5 years of experience and 5 or more trials that have been tried out to a verdict. So it's a pretty high bar. And also this is happening in the context of the legislature. This last legislative session, they amended the state law so that some sex crimes with children under the age of 12 now could be eligible for the death penalty. That's something that in the past was struck down as unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. The lawmakers know this, though, and they think with the new court they could possibly be a test case to get that overturned. So there is a possibility that we could have more people being charged with death penalty crimes. And like we said, there's only 13 attorneys in the state right now who are able to take on those death penalty cases and make sure folks' constitutional rights are protected. And so we're going to keep a close eye on the legislature in the next year to see how receptive they are to the needs from the state public defender's office and what sort of needs those are going to be. It's a new office, so the funding that they assigned to it was a little bit of a shot in the dark based on their best estimates. And there's been a lot of back and forth about that pay rate with people who used to be county public defenders not going to work for the state, but going to private practice because they can make more money. So this is an ongoing conversation. There's still ongoing, legal moves back and forth with the ACLU over the old lawsuit. There's a lot of changes that have happened in Idaho's public defense system, but this is one loose thread that has been buttoned up. There are now official guidelines from the state public defender of what those qualifications are to be a capital defense attorney.
Logan, some good news when it comes to quagga mussels in the Snake River. Can you remind us, before we get into all of this, what a quagga mussel is and why there's been such intense treatment to get rid of them in the Snake River?
Sure thing. So quagga mussels are an invasive species. They're kind of one of the most notorious ones. They're from waterways in Europe and came over to North America in the 80s and 90s on international shipping vessels. And for a long time, they were only, working their way eastward from the Great Lakes through into the other river basins. And so in 2023, the detection of the quagga mussels in the Snake River at Twin Falls was the first time that they'd been detected in the Columbia watershed. So that's kind of our Pacific Northwest Snake River drainage, stretching all the way up into Canada. So the concern is this is the first time that they've been detected in the Columbia, and we want to make sure that they don't spread to all of those neighboring waterways that are all connected. So they're like a little clam almost. But they start out as little microscopic larvae almost. Veligers is the technical term. And so they have been discovered in the water as those larval stage, not fully grown mussels yet, which is good news. And the Idaho State Department of Agriculture especially is really concerned about this because we're a really agriculture heavy state, and these guys will implant themselves on any hard surface they can find, including working their way up into irrigation pipes. And they are also just terrible for the ecological diversity in an area. They can replace up to 80 or 90% of the life in an aquatic system like this. So it could be a really big problem for the Snake River and the rest of the waterways in Idaho.
So they've done 2 years of treatment, Logan, no signs now of this species. So does that mean the issue is cleared up?
Not necessarily. So it's kind of it's a bit of good news, but don't celebrate too early is how I'll summarize it.
Mm,
This week, the Idaho State Department of Agriculture put out a press release saying they've not detected any quagga mussels in that stretch of the river or anywhere else in the state for that matter. They take water samples from all over the state. And if you actually go and look at my story at idahoreports.org, we have a picture in there of not just a mussel veliger, but the mussel veliger, the one that they found in 2023. So you can get a look at how these little guys look under the microscope and just what they're looking for as they're taking these samples. So the infected part of the river at Twin Falls, they've taken over 200 samples so far this year. They've all come back negative. They've taken over 2,500 samples from across the state. But don't celebrate too early because in 2023 and 2024, it wasn't until late September that they
mm.
actually made those detections. So we're only 2/3 of the way through summer. There's still a lot of boating and water recreation going on all over the state. There are mandatory decontamination stations for people taking their boats out of the river down at Twin Falls, but you got to be on the lookout everywhere to make sure that we're not hauling those to other waterways in the state. The section of the river at Twin Falls is a very unique section of the river where they were able to do this copper-based treatment and totally soak the river to a certain concentration of copper, but that's not the case in other parts of the state. We have a lot of really deep lakes where stuff like that just wouldn't even be possible. So that's part of why ISDA is hitting this so hard because they want to, because it was detected in a part of the river where it could be treated, they want to treat it and they want to
Hmm.
treat it aggressively because they have an opportunity to here.
All right. Thanks for that update, Logan. Clark, can you talk to us about some conservation groups who are suing the state over an air quality permit that was issued for the Stibnite gold mine? This is over in central Idaho. And quickly remind us about the mine itself.
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. Like you said, Stibnite Gold Mine is in central Idaho. It's on the Payette National Forest outside the tiny town of Yellow Pine. And it's actually right adjacent to the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, which is one of the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48. And this is a mine that had been used, I think mining at the site dates back to the late 1800s, Gemma, and continued through the 20th century, contributed to the World War II effort. But then mining ended by the 1990s, and the mine was abandoned, and it resulted in a lot of pollution, including arsenic, in the old mine site and in the surrounding river corridors, which are an important habitat for salmon. And so a company called Perpetua Resources, they used to be called Midas Gold, but now they're called Perpetua Resources. They bought the site, and for years they were going through the permitting process. And then either at the very end of 2024 or the very beginning of 2025, the Forest Service finally issued their approval to resume mining at the Stibnite gold mine. And so they were given the approval earlier this year, and then just this past week, two conservation groups, the Idaho Conservation League and Save the South Fork Salmon, filed a lawsuit in Idaho's 4th District Court, and they're suing the state, Gemma, saying that the state did not protect the public when it issued the air quality permit for the mine. And I called Perpetua Resources as well, the owner of the mine, and they said they followed all of the permitting guidelines and that all of this stuff was considered in the permitting process. But I also talked to the Idaho Conservation League and one of their associates, and they're concerned that for a couple of different reasons. We already know that there's arsenic in the rocks and in the water at the mine site, and they're concerned that resuming mining will basically pump all that pollutants out into the air, which would be hazardous to people working at the mine, people in the area. They're also concerned that the road, the mining road, is going to be open to the public and it's exempt from certain kind of pollution regulations. And so those were kind of the two big points of the lawsuit. Nothing's been decided yet. It's a pretty recent filing, but yeah, this has been kind of a controversial proposal that
Mm-hmm.
that conservation groups in the Nez Perce tribe have opposed for years, and this is kind of the latest lawsuit. But the developers of the mine said that all of this has already been considered. They're well within the allowable limits. They're going to be cleaning up the mine as they go, and they said this is just a tactic to delay them opening and to hurt their business. So more information on that at the Idaho Capital Sun. It's a long story about the permitting and the journey and all the public interest, the support and opposition to the mine there, Gemma.
All right, appreciate that, Clark. And as Clark said, he has a great piece if you want to go down to Capital Sun and read the full reporting that Clark did. Caitlin, before we go to break, I think we all heard about these scary moments for a Delta Airlines flight that was going from Salt Lake City to Amsterdam. I believe earlier this week, you talked to an Idaho Falls man who was on that flight. What did he have to say about this?
Right. Yeah. I spoke with Andrew Schneider yesterday, who is an Idaho Falls resident. He's a local real estate agent. And he was actually on his way to Istanbul, Turkey, on Wednesday when he said he experienced what he's only seen in movies. He had just left Salt Lake City en route to Amsterdam to get to Turkey. When just flying right over Wyoming, he says that he started to notice turbulence, but he flies a lot, so he said that's pretty normal. But he said that it did get pretty shaky and pretty bad, and then suddenly the plane nosedived, uh,
Mm.
essentially sending passengers and flight crew flying through the air and hanging onto their chairs. And for the way he described it, did sound like a really scary movie. Luckily, Andrew did have his seatbelt on, so he stayed in his seat, but he said he literally felt himself come out of his chair and was like suspended in the air. He compared it to the feeling of like when you're on a roller coaster and does a really steep drop and you kind of come up and your seatbelt catches you.
Ooh.
He actually watched as the drink cart that they had just brought back past him flew into the air, landed on a female passenger in the row right behind him, went back up into the air, and then landed on another man and broke his leg. So that I
Oh.
can't even imagine how scary that had to be. He mentioned flight attendants, flying into the air and hitting their heads on the ceiling. One of them was it knocked her out. Another passenger flew up into the air and her head cracked open an overhead compartment. Um, all in all, they had about 25 people go to the hospital. Andrew was pretty lucky. He made it out without any injuries. Um, but he said it was a super surreal experience. Eventually, they did divert the plane to Minneapolis, where they were given a free hotel ride or a free hotel and then a ride to the hotel. But he said he hasn't heard anything else from the airline. Um, and then so far, Delta released that most of the passengers and flight crew have been released from the hospital. It's not totally clear how many are still hospitalized, but they did say that all the crew members that were taken to the hospitals were treated and released, and then all customers who were willing to share their status with data with Delta have been
Mm.
evaluated and released. And they did operate a special flight from Minneapolis to Amsterdam yesterday evening, is what their plan was, so that those customers could continue with their journey. But I asked Andrew, if he was afraid of flying after that, and he said that he just is trying not to think about it. And he did consider just turning around and coming back to Idaho Falls, but he said he didn't want to let this what is a really rare experience keep him from
Yeah.
traveling and going on his vacations. So pretty scary,
Oh.
but everybody ended up okay.
Clark, some new federal regulations went into effect, I believe, on May 7th in regards to Real ID enforcement. Remind us what Real ID is.
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. Real ID is actually something Congress created more than 20 years ago in response to the September 11th terrorist attack. And it's calling for enhanced security features on identification, things that make it harder to counterfeit or to fake. And so there was a long ramp up to this being implemented, but you're absolutely right. In May earlier this year, after this kind of 20-year windup, TSA did start enforcing the Real ID requirements. And really who this affects is people using airport security checkpoints, and also folks who may go into certain federal buildings like a courthouse. Idaho offers, they call it the Idaho Star Card. It's the version of our driver's license that complies with Real ID. There was a meeting this week at the Idaho State Capitol where DMV officials said 59% of all Idaho driver's licenses and ID cards are now Star cards. And so that was kind of interesting. More than 900,000 people in Idaho have one of these Star cards, Gemma. Yeah, it actually created this huge backlog at the DMV and the motor vehicle offices. But the message that folks have is that the Star card itself is optional. And a passport and a federal tribal ID also work. So if you don't want to have the Star card, you don't have to. If you don't fly, you don't need it. They still offer regular old driver's licenses without the enhanced security, but those aren't accepted for the Real ID. So you either have to have a passport or some other form of ID. But yeah, I was kind of surprised that the number was that high, to be honest with you, Gemma.
Yeah, I was too, Clark. And also, Clark, remind folks too, because this was the thing that we went through with this was, is it 18 and under or under 18 doesn't have
Yeah, 18
to
and
have
over
the
is
Star
who
card? Is that right?
Yep, it's for passengers 18 and over is who this applies to. But yeah, the transportation department, their message was that a lot of people have these now. The Star card does work for TSA and security, but you can also use a passport. So their message is you don't have to get the Star card if you want. And if you never fly and never go to a federal building, you may never need it. But it's also one of those things that takes weeks or months to get. So if there's even a chance that you might be taking those flights, and if you don't have a passport, probably something to look into. They're still available, still offered by the state of Idaho. And there's information on the DMV website about the documents and the proof that you'll need. There's enhanced kind of documents you need to prove your identity to get one of those Star cards. So we've also got information on that at idahocapitalsun.com for the listeners.
Okay, thanks for that, Clark. So, Caitlin, before we wrap up, tell us about this national anthem standoff that happened during a baseball game earlier this week over in Idaho Falls. And first, okay, I had never heard of this. I mean, maybe it's because I don't watch enough baseball, but can you explain?
Yeah, I also had never heard of it. My coworker Kalama Hines, our sports director, covers all of our sports games and everything in Eastern Idaho, and he saw something that is super rare called an anthem standoff at our last Chuckers game in Idaho Falls. The Idaho Falls Chuckers played the Glacier Range Riders on Tuesday night, and essentially, I guess it happens once or twice per season in Major League Baseball, the national anthem standoff. And how it works is two players, one from each team, will stand with their teammates during the pregame national anthem. But then after the anthem, everyone else, sits down and heads back to the dugout or wherever. And one person from each team continues to stand with their hat over their heart, staring down at either the flag or the other standoff participant.
Okay.
Apparently, usually these standoffs only last like a couple of innings before the players call it quits. It's kind of like a competition kind of thing. But on
Uh-huh.
Tuesday night, Lou Cooper from the Glaciers and Stephen Orderica were very, very committed, and they stayed the entire time, even a little bit afterwards.
The whole
The night,
game?
the whole game, the night, the winds, and everything. At one point, Cooper was called in to pitch in relief, but one of his teammates came in and stood in the standoff for him.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
and they finished. He finished out his pitch in relief, and then came back in and continued. The Glaciers won 5-3, and they stood there for a little bit over 3 hours. Eventually, it came to an end like pretty far after the game, when both of them just kind of tipped their cap to each other and made their way back to their clubhouses. It was a really interesting thing I've never knew anything about.
I had no idea. And I started reading this article, Caitlin, and I was like, what in the world? But
It's really
yeah,
cool.
it really is. Well, thanks so much to all of our reporters for being on the show today, but of course, all of the reporting that they do. Today, we've been speaking with Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com. Brian Clark joined us. He is the Idaho Statesman opinion writer, and Kelsey Mosley Morris with the State's Newsroom, who joined us for the first segment. And remember, folks, you can get all of their reporting on all of their websites. We have some phenomenal journalists in this state. So I encourage you to take some time and read all of the reporting that they do. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.